Welcome back, everyone. Today we are in 1 Samuel chapter 17, 1 through 54. Our title is The Killing a Giant. So this is the story of David and Goliath. If you're new to our channel, we've had a few new people subscribe this week. What we do each day is go through certain Bible passages. We're using this book. It's called The Great Bible Truths, but it simply just categorizes biblical passages in kind of a thematic build-up from Genesis to Revelation. So we've started in Genesis, where we went through the books of the law, and now we are moving to the prophets. So we are in 1 Samuel. You can see any of the previous videos on here, and you don't necessarily have to watch each one of those. If you want to just see what we've read up until this point, the scripture readings are in the description of each video, as will be the questions that the book asks. So this book simply gives us a format, asks some questions, and so, you know, if you are watching this and don't have this book, it's okay. You can just use your own Bible to read the stories, and I'll mention the questions at the end. So 1 Samuel 17, we see Goliath begin to call out the people of Israel, and he's referred to as a champion. And what would often happen in battles is you would have your best fighter, your champion, fight the other army's champion, and whoever wins the war. So rather than go and fight and everybody die off, you send out two men to fight. And that's what Goliath basically says here. Hey, send someone to fight me. And, you know, if they beat me, we'll all be slaves to you. But if I beat them, then you guys got to be slaves to me, to us. And obviously Israel is afraid of Goliath because of his sheer size. Now, the size is an issue that becomes a topic of debate, right? In the sense of giants in the Bible. So some say there's no one that could be 9 feet 9 inches, as we read, or as the King James has it. Now, there have been people, I believe, that have been pretty close to 9 feet. So this isn't perhaps a sheer impossibility, but there is this thing called the square cubed law that scientists point to, that as the size of an animal, we'll say, or a human, right, increases, the joints and all the certain way that person is built, those structures can't hold up. So the way the human anatomy is built, like someone's spine and lower back and all these body parts wouldn't be able to be 100 feet tall. So you couldn't have a 100-foot tall human. You could have a cat, for example, that's small and then really, really big based off their anatomy. But even with a cat, it would break down to a certain size. You couldn't have a 1,000-foot giant cat because of the length of the spine. So I don't want to get into all the science, but some people say 9 feet 9, that's pushing the limits of possibility here, and also in, we'll say, archaeological discovery. And here's just an interesting tidbit, and I think, to me, this does make the most sense, that in some manuscripts, so if you have an NIV or others, you'll see a footnote, some translate Goliath to be, say, 6'9". It's like, depending, there's like 2 cubits in a span, or, you know, there's the official, you know, measuring size of the Hebrews, and it's not exact with ours. But some argue that the way that a certain manuscript that the King James uses has it, it's like a play on words, right? So it's almost like writing it backwards. Instead of 6'9", they accidentally flipped it to make it 9'9". Okay, so this is, again, one of those things where there's 2 manuscripts and the sizes are different, but it's not, again, we know for sure what happens. There's an error. It's almost like putting, you know, a period or a comma in the wrong place, and it changes the meaning. So in one of the manuscripts, something gets flipped, and Goliath is either changed accidentally from 6'9" or from 9 feet 9 to 6'9". So somebody made an error, okay, is ultimately in copying a manuscript, and we know this. So which one is the true one? So many people tend to believe Goliath is 9'9" because that was in the King James Bible, and that's what we've been told. I tend to think 6'7" to 6'9", right, depending on how you translate that size, is probably a better translation, simply because the average Israelite at that time would have been about 5'5". So when we looked at the archaeology of those people of those days, you know, a guy of average height was, you know, 5'4" to 5'5", almost like the size of an average female American. And there's different, even today, right? There's certain races that have an average height of 5'2", and others that have an average height of 6 foot. So it's not like people have changed, you know, through the years. It's just certain people groups have different sizes. So the Philistines were quite large. And the best way I picture it, I meant to actually bring a picture here for you guys, is look up Shaq and Simone Biles. So the gymnast Simone Biles with Shaq, and you'll see them standing next to each other. And it doesn't look real. I mean, he looks 3 times, not 2 times taller than her. So to be a giant, you don't have to be 9 feet. Or even look up Shaq and Muggsy Bogues. You know, so Shaq's about 7 feet, Muggsy Bogues is about 5'5", 5'4", that size of the average Jew, and you'll see that Shaq is indeed a giant. Okay, so you know, if you've ever stood next to a 7-footer as an average person, you'll see that, especially in a warfare, right? If you have this, Andre the Giant would be an example. Go look up Andre the Giant with the other wrestlers. I mean, if you have a 300-pound, you know, 6'9" guy to the average man, that is indeed a giant he would not want to fight. So anyway, I'll end that discussion there, because people get really, you know, what we say, worked up over this issue of like, no, there were giants, and the Bible says there were giants, and to me it does say they're giants, but a guy that's, you know, almost 7 feet would definitely be considered a giant, right, in the sense of warfare. Now, it's possible he was 9 feet, right? That's a possibility. I'm just saying it's not as though if that 9-foot translation is untrue, that somehow the Bible's untrue. One of them have an error. Which one is a question? But this huge Philistine calls out David. Or I'm not David, but David takes the call from this Philistine because no one wants to fight him. And little skirmishes break out on the borders, and that's where you might see in there, like, well, if the fighting broke out, where's Goliath? So usually, basically what happened is they're just trying to hold their borders, and so little border skirmishes probably break out, but no one has engaged in full-out warfare yet, where they're charging in and trying to take over the camp because of Goliath. And Saul gives a promise, right, that if somebody were to beat this guy, right, so they offer anyone who would take up that challenge he'll give him his daughter. The king will give great riches to the man who kills him, and will give him his daughter and make his father's house free in Israel. So no taxes. You get my daughter is your wife, and you'll be rich. So anyone would want this if they thought they had the ability to beat Goliath, but most guys are like, yeah, that's not going to help me if I'm dead. David, on the other hand, takes up this challenge and says, who is this uncircumcised Philistine who's defying the armies of the Most High God? Notice here, David doesn't hear a voice from heaven. We have seen some miraculous signs, right, where Moses sees a burning bush, where Samuel receives a voice from the Lord. David here doesn't receive a miraculous word of knowledge, let's say, right, or hear a voice. He just says, who is this person who is defying the Most High God? Why would this person who is not of Israel dare to defy God's greatness? So his trust is in God and God's greatness. And then he tells the story. He said, I want to fight him. And they're like, no, you can't. Samuel's like, you're going to die. And he says, look, I fought a lion and a bear that tried to take a sheep. So the same God who delivered the lion and the bear into me will deliver me from this Philistine, right? So he'll deliver the Philistine into my hands, actually. So he has, a trust in God, and he interprets the situations that has happened to him as God's deliverance. It wasn't he was more powerful than this lion or bear, or he just got lucky with hitting this lion in a certain way and hit him in the head just perfect. He realizes that it was God who gave him this victory. So in a certain sense, he begins to become fearless because he's just a shepherd. He probably should have let that lion run off with that sheep and lived to fight another day, but he was just a guy that was like, hey, this is my job, this is my task, I'm going to fight to the death. So he had a certain sense of fearlessness about him, but again, it's not just a crazed fearlessness. Like, he starts to see that it's God who's with him, and he's ultimately just doing his job, and he sees that the enemy is calling out to find God, and he says, no, this should not be. And so he has a righteous indignation without hearing from God, mind you, that this is wrong. And so he has a certain conviction of what is right and what is wrong, and he acts upon that conviction. And so that's much more common, right? Most of us aren't going to hear signs from heaven or hear voices, and if we did hear voices, we probably want to question that, right? Even as Samuel does 4 times, right, to make sure it's the Lord. So that's not the normative response in which God works. But David's situation is different. He sees right and wrong, and he sees the need to act in that, on that way. And he puts on this armor. He says, I haven't tested this out. I'm not ready to use this in a fight. So they're trying to give him swords and shields, and he's like, you know what, I'm not going to use it. Just takes his slingshot, takes a few pebbles from the brook, goes off, and Goliath is like almost offended that they send this boy out, and David says, you're going to fall before me this day, basically, right? And does fall before him, and the Israelites are inspired by David killing Goliath and chase the Philistines and defeat the Philistines in battle, and they finally win this war that they had been stalemated in. So our questions today is, what did David say to Saul that showed his faith in God alone? And it's ultimately he said to Saul, because Saul's trying to dissuade him, like, you can't beat him, and he says, the same God who delivered me from the mouth of the lion and the bear shall deliver this uncircumcised Philistine into my hands. And so we see he interprets these things with God as his source of strength. 2, what did David mean when he told Goliath, it is not by sword or spear that the Lord saves? So I didn't say that on my summary, but he says to him, like, don't, and this is what he means, like, don't look at the outward. You see this huge sword and this huge spear that you have. I have these little pebbles, but it's not by power that God is ruled. God is all powerful. So God can defeat you with these little stones, not by the size of the sword or spear. And that's how mankind thinks of it, that it's by the strength of the army. But David realized it's by the strength of those who trust in God. Every battle we wage is a battle of trust in God. 3, describe how David killed Goliath and what happened to the Philistines next. So he hits him right between the forehead and he drops down. David then takes his sword and finishes off Goliath, and the Philistine, or the Israelites, go and chase the Philistines, as I said, and that's the end of this story. So this reading was a little bit longer today, that chapter a little bit longer, but if you have time, go through there and read it. There's obviously some small details I left out, but we'll see you guys tomorrow, and have a blessed day.